The galaxy had learned to fear power, but not kindness, and that was why it almost missed the most dangerous choice ever made. By the time Ethan Walker was led into the Hall of Civic Judgment, the verdict was already waiting in the air like static before a storm. The chamber was built to make every visitor feel smaller than the law. Black alloy walls climbed nearly 100 feet overhead, ribbed with pale light that pulsed in slow intervals, as if the station itself had a heartbeat and it had chosen to remain calm while whole star systems held their breath. Beneath Ethan's boots, the floor was a mirror of dark glass and silver tracer lines, polished so clean that every step looked like it might disappear into space. Around him, rows of elevated platforms curved in a perfect ring, crowded with delegates from worlds he had only seen in shipping manifests and emergency briefings. Some stood in shimmering robes that changed color with their pulse. Others sat inside gravity frames or tanks of glowing fluid. None of them looked at him for long. He was human. That was explanation enough. Ethan adjusted the collar of his service jacket, still carrying the faint smell of coolant and burned wiring from the dockyards. He was not a soldier. He was not a diplomat. He had spent most of his adult life pulling damaged people out of damaged machines and sealing pressure leaks before bad situations became memorials. That was why he had been summoned, they said. A technical witness. A neutral hand. Someone low enough in rank that no one would mistake his presence for influence. At the center of the chamber, under a descending column of white light, knelt the prisoner. Ethan saw her before he understood the silence around her. Blue skin, not bright like paint, but deep and cool like the last edge of daylight on winter ice. A narrow line of silver markings traced from her throat to one side of her jaw, catching the overhead light every time she breathed. The restraint field around her shimmered so thin it was almost invisible, but the way the air bent around her wrists told him it was active and running hot. Her shoulders stayed straight anyway. Not proud. Not broken. Just steady in the way old steel stayed steady even after fire. Lyra Vane. The name had been spoken once in the corridor outside with the kind of caution people used when a truth was too expensive to say twice. Ethan didn't know the politics. He didn't need to. He knew exhaustion when he saw it. He knew pain hidden behind posture. Above the chamber floor, a voice amplified through the vaulted space, smooth and measured enough to sound merciful while stripping the warmth from every syllable. High Executor Cashin Thorne began reciting procedural code for sentencing and planetary compliance, and with each line the hall grew colder. Ethan barely heard the words after the phrase final authorization. His eyes stayed on Lyra's left forearm, where the ceremonial restraint had left a faint fracture line through the outer layer of her armor and the skin beneath it looked too still. Then he noticed the detail nobody else seemed to care about. She was shivering. Not much. Just once, then again, small enough to escape the room unless someone had spent years watching for the signs people tried hardest to hide. Ethan looked up at the ring of delegates, at the polished faces, the patient lights, the ritual calm. A sentence was about to fall on a star system, and the only thing he could think was that someone should have covered her before this room decided her life was already over. The room did not react when Ethan moved at first. That was what made it feel unreal. Hundreds of eyes, hundreds of lenses, dozens of species raised inside systems older and colder than Earth, and not one of them seemed prepared for the possibility that a human might step out of place for something as small as comfort. The pale tribunal light washed across the chamber floor as Ethan reached up, unfastened the thermal wrap from the inside of his service jacket, and took one step toward the center ring. The cloth was nothing special. Standard rescue issue. Heat retentive, ash gray, reinforced at the seams, the kind of thing dockworkers used when a hull breach left metal colder than winter glass. He had used it to wrap children on depressurized transports, mechanics with frozen hands, exhausted miners pulled from airless shafts. Here, in the most powerful room he had ever entered, it suddenly felt almost absurd in his hands. Too ordinary. Too human. That was probably why no one stopped him until he was already kneeling. Up close, the restraint field around Lyra Vane gave off a dry, humming warmth that prickled against his knuckles. It was not enough to injure. It was enough to punish. Enough to remind the prisoner that law, in this chamber, was designed to be felt. Ethan leaned in carefully and settled the thermal wrap over her shoulders without crossing into the glowing perimeter itself. The fabric caught for a second on one edge of her fractured armor, then fell into place. Lyra did not flinch. She did not even look at him right away. Her gaze remained fixed forward, chin lifted a fraction, as if dignity was the last thing in the room they had not yet managed to confiscate. But he saw the change anyway. Her breathing steadied. Just a little. Then the chamber found its voice. It came first as a low wave of translated murmurs, different tones braided together through the hall's audio lattice. Confusion. Offense. Amusement. From somewhere high above, a metallic voice asked whether the witness had misunderstood protocol. Another, smoother and colder, said this was why undeveloped species should not be invited into ceremonial proceedings. Ethan kept one knee on the glass floor and ignored them. He had spent too many years around failing systems to be impressed by elegant alarms. When something was wrong, you fixed the nearest wrong thing first. That was the rule. Not because it made you noble. Because delay made everything harder later. At last Lyra turned her head. Her eyes were not the bright theatrical color he had expected from old recruitment posters and cargo advertisements. They were darker than that, blue-gray with a reflective sheen like storm clouds trapped under ice. Tired eyes. Sharp eyes. The eyes of someone who had already measured everyone in the room and found no reason to trust them. She looked at the thermal wrap around her shoulders, then at Ethan, as if trying to understand what kind of species would interrupt judgment for body heat. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only the nearest receivers carried it back through the chamber. You should step away. Ethan gave the smallest shake of his head. You looked cold. It was a simple answer. Too simple for a room built on hierarchy, doctrine, and spectacle. A ripple passed through the upper platforms. One of the delegates actually laughed, a dry clicking. Sound translated a second later into something almost polite. Then High Executor Cassian Thorne rose from his elevated station, folding his hands behind his back as though this interruption had finally made the proceedings interesting. The white strips of light overhead sharpened, narrowing toward the center ring. Witness Ethan Walker, Thorne said, his amplified voice moving through the hall like polished metal, are we to understand that a citizen of the Alliance's least durable member world intends to instruct this chamber on mercy? Ethan stood then, slowly, because standing too fast in a room like this looked like fear. The floor reflected his face back at him, pale under the tribunal light, collar open, work boots still dusted with the gray residue of docking bay insulation. He looked exactly like what they thought he was. Small. Civilian. Temporary. He glanced once at Lyra, saw the thermal wrap held close at her throat, and then lifted his eyes to the ring of power above him. No, he said, and the chamber quieted just enough to hear the next words clearly. I just know what cruelty looks like when it pretends to be procedure. For a moment, nothing in the hall of civic judgment moved except the light. It slid in cold bands across black alloy and polished glass, touching the delegates one by one as if the chamber itself was deciding who deserved to be seen. Ethan could still feel the last word he had spoken hanging in the air. Procedure. Cruelty. In a room like this, the difference between truth and offense was usually rank. He had neither. High Executor Cassian Thorne did not answer immediately. He simply descended one step from his elevated station, the dark silver of his ceremonial coat catching the tribunal light along the seams. He was human in shape, but not in presence. Too composed. Too precise. He wore authority the way some men wore armor, fitted so close it became hard to tell where the office ended and the person began. That is a serious accusation, Thorne said at last, each syllable polished smooth by years of public judgment. Especially from a dockyard technician invited here as a courtesy. A thin stir moved through the upper platforms. Courtesy. Ethan almost smiled at that. Courtesy was not the word for being summoned across 3 systems to stand in a chamber built to remind lesser worlds how small they were. But he let the thought pass. He had spent enough years around rich men and damaged ships to know that some structures held because everyone inside agreed not to touch the weak points. Then a new voice entered the chamber, sharp and female, carried through the central relay with the clipped certainty of someone who lived inside chain of command. Captain Nora Hayes stood from a lower military tier, one hand resting against the rail in front of her station. Her uniform was Alliance navy gray, severe and immaculate, the kind that left no room for sentiment. "Executor," she said, with respect, "the witness was brought to verify the integrity of the final record stream before sentence confirmation." Thorne turned his head slightly. "And has he done so, Captain?" Nora did not answer at once. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, then to Lyra, then to the translucent panel hovering beside her station. Ethan noticed the pause because he was good at noticing pauses. Pauses meant hidden numbers, missing names, bad pressure seals, somebody somewhere deciding whether honesty was survivable. "The record stream is intact," Nora said finally. "But there are restricted appendices attached to the prisoner file." This time the chamber truly shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. A few delegates leaned forward. A cluster of pale glyphs lit up over one of the distant platforms. Ethan looked down at Lyra. She had gone very still again, but it was a different stillness now. Not exhaustion. Readiness. As if she had heard a door unlock somewhere far down a corridor and had not yet decided whether it led to freedom or fire. Thorne's expression barely changed. Restricted appendices are not unusual in wartime adjudication. "No, sir," Nora said, voice even. "These are sealed above my access tier." Which is unusual. The words landed harder than volume ever could. Ethan saw it then, the thing no one had wanted said plainly. This hearing had arrived already trimmed and polished. Clean lines. Limited facts. A sentence shaped before the room pretended to discover it. He had seen repair reports like that after station collapses. Management always called them preliminary. What they meant was edited. Lyra lifted her gaze to Nora for the first time, and something unspoken passed between them, something old and disciplined and dangerous. Not friendship. Recognition. The kind that came from surviving the same machine without trusting it. Ethan's pulse slowed instead of quickened. That always happened when a situation finally stopped pretending to be simple. Simplicity was for announcements. Reality had layers. Thorne folded his hands behind his back again. "Captain Hayes," he said, "you are drifting beyond your assigned function." "I am confirming context, sir." "Context is granted by this chamber." Nora drew one quiet breath. "Or withheld by it." Several translation nodes chirped at once as the remark traveled across species and syntax. Ethan could almost hear the room recalculating. Above him, the light narrowed further around the center ring, drawing him, Lyra, and the restraint field into a brighter circle while the delegates receded into shadow. It felt less like illumination than selection. Lyra turned her head a fraction toward Ethan, the thermal wrap still gathered close around her shoulders, and when she spoke her voice was low enough that the room had to choose to listen. "You still have time to step back," she said. "From what?" Ethan asked. Her eyes held his for one long second, deep blue-gray and unreadable at the edges. "From learning why they needed you here before they needed the truth." The chamber did not feel larger after Lyra spoke. It felt narrower. As if the walls had leaned in by an inch and decided that whatever happened next would belong to everyone present whether they wanted it or not. Ethan held her gaze for half a second longer, then looked past her to the circles of authority rising into shadow. He had spent enough years in shipyards to know when a system had been designed to look transparent while hiding the real wiring behind sealed panels. This room had the same smell of polished control. Cold air. Ozone from the restraint field. Filtered perfume from the upper tiers. And under it all, the faint metallic scent of overheated circuitry carrying more load than it was meant to admit. High Executor Cassian Thorne stepped closer to the edge of his platform, hands still folded behind his back. He looked less irritated now than curious, and that was worse. Irritation belonged to people who had lost control of the moment. Curiosity belonged to people deciding how to use it. "Witness Ethan Walker," he said, voice calm enough to sound almost kind, "you have confused proximity with relevance. This chamber was not convened to test your personal conscience." Ethan glanced at the reflected light under his boots, then back up. "Then why bring me 3 systems from the dockyards to certify a record no one was planning to question?" A hush traveled outward in concentric waves. Even the translation lattice seemed to delay itself by a breath, as if reluctant to carry the sentence any farther than necessary. Captain Nora Hayes did not move, but the panel near her station brightened, lines of sealed text flickering under military encryption. She was reading fast. Ethan could tell by the stillness in her shoulders. People only got that still when they were forcing themselves not to react in public. Thorne turned slightly toward her. "Captain, lock your interface." "On what authority?" Nora asked. It was not defiance in her tone. It was procedure sharpened to a point. For the first time, Ethan saw something flicker behind Thorne's composure. Small. Gone almost instantly. "But there." "On mine," Thorne said. Nora's jaw tightened. "Then you are invoking executive seal over an active sentencing review." More movement now. Delegates shifting. Screens adjusting. Quiet private channels coming alive in the dark. Ethan did not understand half the legal architecture in the room, but he understood pressure. He understood what happened when too many hands tried to hold a failing hatch closed. Someone always started giving orders louder than necessary. Lyra drew a slow breath beneath the thermal wrap. "This is the moment," she said quietly, not to the room, only to Ethan. "The moment where decent people decide whether comfort matters more than truth." He looked down at her. Up close, the silver markings along her jaw caught in the white tribunal light and turned almost pale. She still looked exhausted. Still looked cold. But there was steel under it now, something measured and ancient in the way she sat inside the restraint field without asking anyone to save her. Ethan had known men like that after rescue extractions, people who had already accepted the worst and so could not be manipulated by the threat of it anymore. "You knew this would happen," he said. "I knew they would want a witness from a species they considered harmless," Lyra replied. "Harmless is useful in rooms built on appearances." The word settled hard inside him. Harmless. He thought of Earth's file in the Alliance Index, the patronizing language, the economic footnotes, the strategic assessments that always used phrases like developing resilience and limited biological durability. Weak. That was the word powerful systems used when they meant unlikely to resist. Above them, Thorne lifted one hand, and the central lights tightened another degree. "This chamber will proceed," he announced. "The prisoner's file remains sealed by lawful order. The witness will return to his assigned marker. Captain Hayes will suspend all unauthorized access. Compliance will be noted." Ethan heard it then, tucked beneath the polished authority. Not confidence. Urgency. Small, controlled, but real. A man protecting procedure did not sound like that. A man protecting a secret did. He looked once at Nora. She did not nod. She did not signal. But her eyes met his across the chamber, and in that brief glance he saw the answer plain as a distress beacon. There was something in those sealed appendices important enough to bend the entire hearing around it. Something they did not want spoken while the hall was still full. Ethan let out a slow breath. The kind he used before cutting power to a failing system and hoping the backup grid held. Then, with every platform watching, he stepped away from his assigned marker instead of toward it. The sound of Ethan's boots crossing the glass floor was almost too soft to matter, but in the hall of civic judgment it landed like a challenge. One step. Then another. No rank. No weapon. No authority except the simple refusal to return to the place they had assigned him. Above him, the concentric tiers of delegates seemed to recede into a colder dark, their faces and masks and polished observation lenses lit by the tribunal glow in fragments. He could feel the chamber adjusting around him, not physically, but socially, the way a powerful room recalculated when someone insignificant stopped behaving as expected. High Executor Cassian Thorne did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Witness Walker," he said, "that is your final directive." Ethan kept moving until he stood just outside the shimmer of Lyra's restraint field. Heat brushed the front of his jacket. Dry, precise, engineered heat. The kind designed not to injure in public, only to remind a body that mercy had not been included in the settings. He looked at the field, then at the woman inside it. Lyra Vane had not shifted. The thermal wrap still rested around her shoulders, softening the hard geometry of fractured ceremonial armor. Up close, he could see the faint rise and fall of her breathing beneath the cloth, measured now, controlled by effort. Not weakness. Discipline. The chamber had mistaken one for the other. "You brought me here to certify truth," Ethan said, lifting his eyes to Thorne. "If there are sealed appendices attached to the sentence, then truth is not what this room is presenting." Murmurs moved again through the upper tiers, less amused now, more careful. Ethan could hear the translation lattice working in overlapping tones, carrying his words into dialects built for air, liquid, static, and light. He wondered how many species in the room had ever heard a human speak without asking permission first. Captain Nora Hayes remained at her station, one hand still near the encrypted panel, though she had not touched it again. Her face was composed in the military way, but there was strain under it now, thin as a hairline crack in tempered glass. She knew something. More than that, she knew the cost of knowing it in the wrong company. Thorne stepped down one more level from his platform, enough to narrow the distance without surrendering height. "You are confusing access with understanding," he said. "State function often requires containment." Ethan almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in the room. He had heard that language before, only in different forms. At shipyards after preventable accidents. In transport hearings when corporate shortcuts became folded condolences. People with polished collars always had a vocabulary for why ordinary lives had to absorb extraordinary dishonesty. Containment. Necessary omission. Stability. The words changed. The pattern did not. Lyra's voice reached him quietly from inside the field. "They will offer you a path back." Ethan kept his gaze forward. "I noticed. It will sound reasonable." That is usually how bad deals start. Something changed in her expression then, not quite a smile, not even close, but the edge of one thought recognizing another. For the first time since he had entered the chamber, Ethan saw not only endurance in her face, but attention. As if she had stopped seeing him as an interruption and started seeing him as a variable no one else had planned for. Above them, one of the delegate platforms ignited with a pale request glyph. Another followed. Then two more. Questions were being filed now. Objections. Demands for review. The chamber was no longer a sealed performance. It was becoming unstable, and everybody felt it. Thorne saw it too. That was the only explanation for what came next. When he spoke again, his tone was smoother than before, but it had been sharpened underneath. "Very well," he said. "Since the witness seems eager to misunderstand his importance, let us simplify the matter. Ethan Walker, you will return to your marker within 60 seconds and preserve your standing as an external technical observer. Fail to comply, and the record will show voluntary interference in an active tribunal. Your protections will be revoked." Your citizenship privileges within Alliance space will be suspended pending review. The words settled over the chamber with ceremonial precision. Not a threat, not in the language of power. Just consequences. Dignified. Legal. Clean enough to pass inspection. Ethan felt the weight of them anyway. Dock access gone. Transit access gone. Work licenses frozen. One sealed judgment could make a civilian disappear without anyone having to raise a hand. The overhead lights shifted, and a narrow line of pale numerals ignited above the center ring. 60. 59. 58. A countdown, bright and calm, as if the room preferred obedience to arrive on schedule. Ethan looked up at the numbers, then across the tiers, then down at Lyra. She did not ask him to stay. That was what struck him hardest. No pleading. No strategy whispered through clenched teeth. Only that same terrible steadiness, as if she would rather lose everything than ask another person to surrender himself in her place. In the dockyards back on Earth, Ethan had once worked a rescue after a cargo spindle fire where a father kept passing the last safe oxygen mask to other people until someone forced one back onto his face. Ethan had never forgotten the look in that man's eyes. Not bravery. Not panic. Just the stubborn belief that someone else's breathing still counted, even when the math said otherwise. The timer dropped to 46. 45. Ethan drew one slow breath. The hall smelled like ionized air and expensive silence. Somewhere high above, an observer shifted in a fluid cradle. A translation node clicked. Captain Hayes stared at him without moving. Thorne waited with the confidence of a man who had watched weaker people fold all his life. Ethan lowered his eyes to the shimmering edge of the restraint field, then to the thermal wrap gathered at Lyra's throat. A small thing. Ordinary fabric. An act so minor it should have vanished the moment it happened. Instead it had opened a seam in the whole chamber. He understood then that this was not about whether he could save her. It was about whether the room would be allowed to teach itself, one more time, that comfort mattered more than conscience. The timer fell to 38 and Ethan did not move. The timer above the center ring moved with the indifference of machine logic. 37. 36. 35. The pale digits reflected in the black glass under Ethan's boots and turned the floor into a second countdown beneath him, as if the chamber wanted him surrounded by the mathematics of surrender. He kept his eyes on the numbers for one more second, then let them drift past the glowing line of the restraint field, past the delegates stacked in arcs of shadow and light, and finally to Captain Nora Hayes. She still had not touched her panel. That mattered. In a room built on obedience, hesitation was its own language. Ethan had seen it in mechanics who found forged inspections, in medics ordered to sign discharge forms too early, in line supervisors told to smile through preventable losses. The body always knew before the mouth decided whether to tell the truth. 30 seconds, High Executor Cassian Thorne said, not because anyone needed the reminder, but because power liked hearing itself remain calm. Ethan looked back at him. You are very certain I should not ask what is in those appendices. Thorne did not blink. You are not cleared to ask. That was not what I said. A few of the upper platforms brightened as private requests multiplied. The chamber could feel its own balance shifting now. Ethan could feel it too in the air, in the way conversation no longer moved as a single controlled current but in splinter channels, quick and nervous and impossible to fully mute. One of the translation nodes above the witness ring chirped twice, then fell silent. Somewhere across the hall, a delegate's liquid cradle dimmed from blue to amber. Tiny signs. Minor failures. Nothing dramatic. Just the first hints of a system under strain. Lyra's voice came low from within the shimmer. If you stay, they will make you part of the proceeding. Ethan kept his gaze forward. I assumed that was already happening. No, she said. This is still theater. In a moment it becomes record. That landed harder than anything Thorne had said. Ethan knew the difference. Theater was pressure. Record was architecture. Once a thing entered the official structure, it stopped being a moment and became a road others could be forced to walk later. He glanced down at Lyra. The thermal wrap still rested over her shoulders, plain ash gray against the deep blue of her skin and the cold silver fracture in her armor. She looked composed, but the kind of composed that cost energy. Not ornamental dignity. Worked for dignity. Like someone holding a door shut from the inside without making noise about the effort. The timer dropped to 24. 23. Then Captain Nora Hayes moved. Not much. Just enough to place 2 fingers on the edge of her console. A column of encrypted symbols rose above it, then flattened into a red access denial. Her jaw tightened. Ethan saw the result before he understood its full meaning. She had tried something and the chamber had blocked her. Executor, Nora said, her voice level, my request for restricted review has been denied under emergency seal. That phrase passed through the room like a change in pressure. Emergency seal. Ethan did not know every procedural implication, but he knew enough. Emergencies were supposed to be declared in response to danger. Not curiosity. Not oversight. Danger. Thorne answered without turning toward her. The restriction remains lawful. Lawful under what threat? Nora asked. Thorne's silence lasted half a beat too long. There it was again. Not enough for panic. More than enough for doubt. Ethan felt the pieces align in his head with the cold clarity that sometimes came right before a hard decision. They had brought in a human technician because humans were considered harmless, transparent, politically disposable. They had expected him to validate the stream, witness the sentence, and leave with just enough official proximity to make the whole hearing look clean. But something in Lyra's file was dangerous enough that even an officer like Nora Hayes could not see it once the room was full. Which meant the threat was not the prisoner. The threat was exposure. The timer hit 18. 17. The pale digits seemed brighter now, almost tender in their precision. Ethan thought. Of Earth again, of all the reports written by people who assumed weakness meant compliance. He thought of long shifts in freezing dock corridors, of learning that the most important repairs were never glamorous. You found the stress point. You held the line. You bought enough time for truth to catch up with the damage. Thorne's voice came down from the platform, quieter now, and somehow more dangerous for it. Return to your marker, Mr. Walker. You have no standing here beyond what I permit. Ethan let that sentence settle. No standing beyond what I permit. Not law. Not justice. Permission. Around the hall, delegates listened in stillness sharp enough to cut. No one interrupted. No one defended him. No one defended Lyra. It was the old pattern, scaled to a galactic level. Everyone waiting for someone else to risk being first. The timer fell to 12. 11. 10. Lyra turned her head slightly toward him, and when she spoke, her voice was almost lost beneath the hum of the restraint field. If you step back now, they will call you wise. Ethan looked at her, at the cold steadiness in her eyes, at the exhaustion she refused to perform, and then beyond her to the tiers of power arranged like an altar to controlled fear. Maybe, he said softly. Then he lifted his chin toward Captain Hayes. Captain, does Alliance Civic Code still recognize low-tier civilian invocation during active review? Nora's eyes widened just enough to be real. It was the first open expression she had allowed herself since the hearing began. Yes, she said after a beat. In theory. Thorne's posture changed. Not much. But enough. That statute is obsolete. Obsolete is not repealed, Nora replied. The chamber went so quiet Ethan could hear the faint crackle where the restraint field met the cooling seam of the thermal wrap. 9. 8. 7. He felt fear then, finally honest and clean. Not fear of pain. Not even fear of punishment. Fear of becoming a man who saw the weak point, understood the cost, and still chose the safer silence. He had met too many good people ruined by that choice in small ordinary ways. Careers protected. Reports signed. Eyes lowered. A life did not collapse all at once. It went piece by piece, every time comfort won. 6. 5. Ethan drew a breath that tasted like ionized air and polished metal. Then I invoke it, he said. The words were not loud, but they entered the chamber like a dropped tool in a quiet engine room. Nora's console flashed white. Multiple platforms lit at once. Somewhere high in the tiers, someone whispered a translation of the statute in disbelief. Thorne stepped forward, the first visible fracture in his composure finally showing at the edges. 4. 3. The pale numerals above the ring halted, flickered once, and vanished. The chamber changed the instant the countdown died. Not loudly. Not with alarms or dramatic lights. It changed the way a sealed room changes when a pressure lock releases somewhere deep in the hull. The air stayed cold. The delegates stayed in their tiers. High Executor Cassian Thorne remained standing in polished stillness above the center ring. And yet nothing in the Hall of Civic Judgment felt fully under his control anymore. Ethan could see it in the scattered activation glow across the platforms, in the sudden bloom of procedural glyphs over private consoles, in the minute delay before translated speech crossed the chamber. The invocation had done what old statutes sometimes did when powerful people forgot they still existed. It had forced the room to remember its own architecture. Captain Nora Hayes was already moving, fingers crossing her console in fast, precise commands. A suspended panel of pale text rose above her station, no longer read with denial but layered now with review prompts, civic code references, and a flashing line that made several delegates lean forward at once. Civilian challenge recognized. Conditional record opening pending chamber response. Ethan did not understand every legal branch unfolding in front of him, but he understood enough. The hearing had been designed as a straight road. He had just introduced a turn. Thorne's voice came down sharp for the first time, the smooth polish still there but tightened underneath. This proceeding was never intended to trigger archival exposure. Nora did not look away from her panel. That is precisely why the statute exists. Ethan stood beside the shimmer of Lyra's restraint field and felt the dry heat brush his sleeves. The thermal wrap still rested on her shoulders, the plain gray fabric looking almost defiant in a room built out of ceremonial severity. He glanced at her. She had not changed position, but the stillness around her had changed in meaning. Before, she had looked like someone enduring the last step of a verdict. Now she looked like someone listening for a distant mechanism beginning, at last, to turn. What happens now? Ethan asked quietly. Lyra's eyes remained on the tiers above them. Now they decide whether law belongs to truth, or only to power. It was the kind of sentence that would have sounded theatrical from anyone else. From her, inside that field, with half the galaxy watching and half of it pretending not to care, it landed with the weight of observation. Across the chamber, more request glyphs ignited. Some delegates were demanding closure. Others were demanding review. Ethan could tell even without understanding the symbols. The emotional pattern was universal. The room was dividing. Not into heroes and villains. Into something more common and more dangerous. Those who wanted to know, and those who wanted this to end before knowledge became expensive. Thorne descended another step from his platform. He was close enough now that Ethan could see the narrow silver threading at the cuffs of his coat and the fine strain at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Walker," he said, "you have mistaken an obsolete procedural courtesy for moral authority." Ethan met his gaze. "No. I used the only authority you left in reach." That line moved through the delegates like a charge. Several translation nodes chirped at once. One of the upper galleries dimmed, then brightened as new observers joined the public relay. The hearing was no longer contained. The silence around the center ring thickened with attention. Nora's console flashed white again. Then gold. Ethan saw her shoulders stiffen. "The archive is responding," she said. Her voice remained military even now, but there was something under it he had not heard before. Not fear. Not exactly. Recognition. A sealed wartime appendix has been attached to the sentence confirmation file under executive suppression. The review statute requires a witness position to open a summary tier. Thorne turned toward her fully. "Do not proceed." Nora lifted her eyes from the panel. "The chamber has to vote to block it." That was the moment Ethan understood why they had wanted him harmless. A low-tier civilian invocation did not break the law. It dragged the law out where other people had to be seen touching it. Lyra finally looked up at him again. In the blue-gray of her eyes there was no surprise now, only a difficult kind of respect, the kind offered when someone has stepped into danger without decorating himself for it. "You can still withdraw your standing before summary release," she said. The record would close again. Ethan knew what she was offering. Not an escape from consequences. An escape from scale. If he backed down now, this would remain one strange moment in a chamber far from Earth. If he stayed, whatever came out next would become larger than either of them. He thought of dockyard mornings under sodium lamps, of coffee gone cold beside diagnostic screens, of ordinary people signing their names to repairs because lives depended on details no one would ever praise. He had never imagined that same instinct could follow him here, all the way to the center of galactic power. But maybe that was the point. Conscience rarely arrived wearing rank. Thorne raised one hand to address the chamber, and this time his command carried a note he could not fully hide. "Delegates," he said, "what lies behind that seal concerns wartime necessity and intersystem stability. This is not material for public sentiment." Ethan heard the phrase and felt something settle hard inside him. Public sentiment. That was what men like Thorne called compassion when they needed it to sound unserious. He looked at the tiers surrounding them, at the watchers from 100 worlds sitting in curated light, and realized they were waiting for someone else to decide whether decency counted as a legal force. Nora's console emitted a low tone. The summary tier was ready. The chamber had seconds to object. No one spoke fast enough. No one moved first. And in that widening silence, Ethan Walker understood that the strongest thing he had ever done was not stepping forward. It was refusing, one more time, to step back. The summary tier opened without spectacle. No hidden doors. No alarms. No cinematic warning from the chamber ceiling. Just a clean band of pale light crossing every active platform at once, followed by a silence so precise it felt engineered. Captain Nora Hayes stood motionless at her console as the first lines of the sealed appendix resolved into public text above the center ring. The letters hung in the air in white and gold, large enough for every delegate to see, simple enough that no translation delay could soften them before. Understanding arrived. Wartime Directive 17. Civilian suppression authorized. Planetary ignition request submitted. Command refusal registered by Field Marshal Lyra Vane. Ethan read the lines once, then again, because his mind rejected them the first time on principle. Around the chamber, private channels died one by one. The little lights above delegate stations went dark. Not because the systems failed, but because no one wanted the record of what they had almost defended. Lyra did not lower her eyes. The tribunal light caught the silver trace along her jaw and turned it cold as frost. She had been kneeling in the center of the chamber like a criminal while the truth sat sealed behind executive language. Not a traitor. Not unstable. Not dangerous in the way they had implied. Dangerous only because she had refused to make obedience holier than conscience. Ethan looked up toward High Executor Cassian Thorne. For the first time since entering the hall, he saw the man not as authority but as a shape built around fear. Not fear of disorder. Fear of memory. Fear that the polished structure around him might crack if people remembered what it had cost to keep it standing. Nora's console continued to scroll, opening the summary by mandatory sequence. Timestamps. Fleet coordinates. Signature chains. Emergency justification. Each line was colder than the last because each line was so clean. That was the cruelty of systems like this. They buried the unbearable under excellent formatting. One of the upper delegates made a low sound through a translator grill, something between disbelief and grief. Another physically turned away from the display. Across the chamber, a cluster of military observers who had remained rigid through the entire proceeding now stood in stunned stillness, as if posture itself had become meaningless. Ethan had expected outrage when the truth arrived. Anger. Denial. Public theater from people trying to save themselves. But that was not what happened. The room did something worse for the people who had engineered it. It understood. Lyra finally spoke, and she did not raise her voice. She did not need to. They ordered the cleansing of a civilian world because surrender would have looked weak, she said. I refuse to authorize the signal. The words passed through the chamber as fact, not performance. Ethan felt them settle into the architecture of the room, into the law itself, where they could no longer be reshaped by tone. Thorne straightened, trying to reclaim the height of his station through posture alone. Field command operates under pressure civilians do not comprehend. Ethan turned toward him before he had fully decided to speak. No, he said, and the sound of his own voice carried farther now because the hall had become honest enough to hear it. Civilians comprehend exactly what happens when powerful people decide other lives are acceptable losses. No one laughed this time. No one rolled their eyes at the dockworker from Earth. The phrase acceptable losses hung above the polished floor and every species in the room knew its own version of those words. Lyra shifted for the first time since the summary release, not in weakness but with deliberate care, bringing one hand to the edge of the thermal wrap at her shoulder as though grounding herself in the small human object that had disrupted the ceremony. She looked at Ethan then, fully, and there was no distance left in her gaze. Only exhaustion, intelligence, and something rarer than gratitude. Recognition. Not of rank. Not of species. Of moral cost. Nora's panel emitted another low tone. Automatic review complete. Sentence integrity voided pending chamber reconsideration. The restraint field around Lyra flickered once, dimmed by a fraction, then steadied again under procedural hold. The chamber had not freed her yet, but it had stopped pretending she deserved to be condemned. That alone changed the weight of the air. The delegates did not know where to look. At Lyra, who had refused an order and been punished for retaining a soul. At Nora, who had chosen the law over the comfort of hierarchy. At Thorne, whose authority now looked less like leadership than maintenance of a lie. Or at Ethan Walker, a human mechanic in work boots and a worn service jacket, standing where he did not belong because kindness had led him there one ordinary decision at a time. Then Archon Selvek rose from the highest tier. Ethan had barely noticed the ancient delegate before, a tall figure draped in matte black ceremonial layers, face framed by thin bands of silver light that marked rank older than most modern treaties. When Selvek stood, the chamber seemed to align itself by instinct. The old delegate looked first at the exposed record, then at Lyra, then finally at Ethan. For 3 cycles, Selvek said, voice. Resonant and steady through every translator in the hall, this chamber described humanity as biologically fragile, politically immature, and strategically minor. The words should have sounded insulting. Instead they sounded like an indictment of everyone who had said them. Selvek let the silence widen before continuing. Yet when confronted by power without mercy, it was a human civilian who acted first in defense of dignity. No one interrupted. Thorne did not object. The law itself seemed to hold its breath. Ethan did not feel triumphant. He felt cold. Tired. a little afraid of how far one decent choice could travel once it escaped the place where it began. Selvek's gaze remained fixed on him. Perhaps, the Archon said, the weakest species in this chamber was merely the last to mistake compassion for weakness. And this time, when the words faded, the galaxy did not answer. Archon Selvek's words did not echo. They settled. That was somehow heavier. In the Hall of Civic Judgment, where every surface had been designed to magnify authority and polish intention until it gleamed, the silence that followed felt like the first honest thing the chamber had produced all day. Ethan Walker stood beside the restraint field with the dry heat still brushing his sleeves and became suddenly aware of his own body again. The stiffness in his shoulders. The burn of cold air in his lungs. The dull ache in his feet from standing too long on unforgiving glass. He was just a dockworker from Earth in a service jacket that still smelled faintly of coolant and machine dust. He did not look like history. He looked tired. Maybe that was why the moment mattered. No one in the chamber could pretend now that this had been a contest of power. Power had already spoken. Power had arranged the hearing, sealed the record, framed the sentence, and trusted ritual to finish what fear had started. And still, in the center of it all, something smaller had held. Captain Nora Hayes lowered her hands from the console at last. The pale screens around her dimmed from urgent white to procedural blue. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the strain it had earlier. Not because the cost had vanished, but because it had arrived and there was no point pretending otherwise. Sentence integrity has been voided, she said. Executive suppression is under formal review. Field. Marshal Lyra Vane is to be released from punitive restraint pending chamber reassessment. No applause followed. No dramatic shift in music that did not exist. Just the soft mechanical sound of legal authority changing direction. The restraint field around Lyra shimmered once, its hard white edge loosening into threads of faint light before dissolving into the air. The temperature around the center ring changed immediately. Less dry. Less cruel. Lyra did not rise at first. She remained exactly where she was for one measured breath, then another, as if her body needed time to believe what the chamber had finally admitted. Ethan looked down at her and saw that the thermal wrap had slipped slightly from one shoulder. Without thinking, he reached to adjust it. His fingers hesitated for the briefest instant, uncertain now that she was no longer a prisoner and no longer someone the room had permission to mistreat. Lyra noticed the hesitation. Slowly, with a care that made the gesture feel almost ceremonial, she lifted one hand and steadied the edge of the wrap with him. Her skin was cool. Not fragile. Simply real. When she rose, she did it without spectacle, unfolding to her full height in the pale tribunal light until she stood half a head taller than Ethan, the silver markings along her throat and jaw catching faint reflections from the chamber ceiling. No one ordered her to kneel again. No one dared. Across the tiers, delegates who had arrived expecting judgment now sat in the discomfort of witness. Some looked at their consoles as if searching for procedural shelter. Others looked openly at Ethan, not with admiration exactly, but with the unsettled attention reserved for people who have altered a room's moral temperature and cannot easily be categorized afterward. High Executor Cashinthorne remained on his platform, still perfectly composed if you did not know where to look. Ethan knew now. The tightness at the mouth. The overcareful stillness in his hands. The posture of a man who had not lost control all at once, only piece by piece, each one too small to stop until the whole structure had slipped beyond him. Thorne said nothing. He no longer owned the shape of the room enough to risk speech. Archon Selvek inclined their head, not toward the chamber, but toward Lyra first, and then toward Ethan. It was not a grand gesture. It was smaller than that. Older. Recognition stripped of performance. Lyra followed the movement with her eyes, then turned fully toward Ethan. Up close, the exhaustion in her face had not disappeared. If anything, it showed more clearly now that she no longer needed to hide it behind defiance. But there was something else there too, quiet and steady as starlight on dark water. "On my world," she said, her voice low enough that the hall had to lean into silence to hear it, "strength is measured by what a person can endure alone." Her gaze dropped briefly to the ash-gray wrap between them, then returned to his face. "I think your species measures it differently." Ethan let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like an hour. "Most days," he said, "we are just trying to get through without becoming the worst thing in the room." It was not a heroic answer. He did not know how to make one. Maybe that was why Lyra's expression changed the way it did, not into a smile exactly, but into something rarer and more lasting, as if a closed distance had finally found language. Around them, the chamber remained silent. Not frozen. Not empty. Silent in the way forests fell silent when something larger than fear had entered them. Ethan looked out across the tiers of power, the polished rails, the dimmed consoles, the watching faces from worlds he would never see, and understood that the silence no longer belonged to authority. It belonged to shame. It belonged to recognition. It belonged to the unbearable fact that a species dismissed as weak had not conquered anyone, had not threatened anyone, had not won through force, and had still become the standard by which the whole room now stood exposed. Lyra's hand remained lightly against the thermal wrap at her shoulder, keeping it closed against the chamber's cold. Ethan noticed then that his own hand was still there too, rough from years of labor, reddened at the knuckles by work and dry station air. Human hands. Ordinary hands. The kind that patched hull seams, lifted crates, fixed broken couplings, and reached for strangers before permission arrived. For one brief second, reflected in the black glass beneath them, their hands rested side by side like a promise neither of them had intended to make and neither of them would insult. By naming too soon. Then Lyra let the fabric settle, straightened to her full height, and faced the chamber as a free woman. No one challenged it. No one even tried. The stars beyond the upper observation slits were faint in the station glare, little more than white pins over black infinity, but Ethan found himself looking at them anyway. They had not changed. The galaxy was still cold. Still ruled by treaties, fleets, economies, and men who would always be tempted to call cruelty necessary when it wore enough ceremony. But something had changed in the hall beneath those stars. Not the law by itself. Not the system. Something smaller. Someone had refused to let mercy be treated as weakness, and because of that refusal, an entire chamber had been forced to remember that dignity was not a decorative value. It was the line between civilization and performance. Ethan did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who would sleep badly after too much adrenaline, whose transit privileges might still vanish by morning, whose life had just been made far more complicated than it had been at breakfast. But as the chamber stood in its vast and humbled silence, and Lyra Vane remained unbowed beside him, he understood a truth so simple it almost hurt. In a galaxy built to honor